All right. Welcome back to the Family Astrologer, a space where we can delight in all conversations connected to family astrology and its related topics. And I'm very excited to invite my guest, Isaiah Alpheratz, aka the Elysian Aquarius. And we're going to talk about what happens when you're born on your parents' Saturn return. But before we get there, I would love for the audience to hear a little bit more about you, Isaiah. Can you tell us about yourself and a little bit about your practice?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been, first of all, I'm honored to be here with you and share this conversation with you today. But yeah, I've been doing astrology for around 6 years now, just with studying and practicing and going through it. Officially for around 3 years, which has been a journey in sustaining yourself with astrology. But initially, my practice started with Hellenistic astrology, and I kind of like started to incorporate a lot more modern interpretations and part of the practice. It's varied as it's grown to become quite non-denominational and to be something that I guess centers everyone's experience. One thing that was important to me was that there wasn't a lot of representation when I first joined, just with people who looked like me or had certain cultural significance within astrology. So I wanted to kind of bring that back and make sure I centered first and foremost kind of BIPOC people, just to ensure that there was something to relate to. But I've always wanted to ensure as well that everyone could relate to the practice. And so accessibility has always been at the forefront of my astrology, and making the language something that's easy to understand, because I mean, you know how hard it can be when you get into astrology to break down everything to make sure it's understandable. So
Totally.
that's something that I really value with my practice, and make sure of within content, within consultations, and hopefully within this conversation today as well.
Beautiful. Now, Isaiah, I've been following you on socials for a long time. I love your presence in the community, and I love hearing your voice in the community. And one of the things that really stood out to me recently, you did a thread about what happens when your parents Saturn return. And that thread
Yeah.
really stuck with me. And that's why I really wanted to have you here to share in this conversation. So I definitely want to get into that, but let's definitely cover some basics here a little bit. So
Sure.
let's talk about who is Saturn? Who is Saturn? Let's cover that bullet point. Why would Saturn be important to like becoming a parent, do we think?
Yeah, I think we all know Saturn has massive significance within the birth chart and just within someone's lives. I think if there's, even for people who aren't into astrology much, one thing they know is, the Saturn return. It's going to come around the age of 30, and they're interested in it, and they know it's a period of change. And I think that's why, for me, Saturn is so significant, especially when we're looking at kind of parental or familial astrology, is because Saturn is this planet that speaks of form, and it speaks of time and how we define things and how we exist within the containers of our lives. And I think when someone becomes a parent, that shifts so dramatically, something which you understand as well as a parent too. That container changes, and it shifts to now value and honor and support a whole new being, right? And Saturn comes and kind of changes the dynamic. It brings new conditions, new challenges, new points of change that activate, I think, something no one can really tap into until they become a parent or experience that new dynamic. And so it's just a really important planet for understanding the kind of creative potential in which someone can reach once hitting that kind of parental status, and having to now nourish this new person and make sure that they're okay. And, we see what happens when there's neglect. We see what happens when there's trauma or something goes wrong in a child's life. And that as well in their own chart can reflect the kind of Saturn conditions. At least I know that from personal experience and working with clients as well. So yeah, Saturn is it's just an amazing planet to kind of value and look into when we understand what's happening within a parent's life and a child's life, and how they're going to connect with each other too.
Totally. Yeah. And Saturn, out of like all the transiting voices of the planets, Saturn is kind of the planet that says you are responsible. And it's
Yeah.
like, a lot of times with Pluto, there's this big life change that's happening to you or from within you, or with eclipses, for example. But when you're going through a Saturn transit, Saturn is usually saying, hey, like it's on you, dog. Like how
Yeah,
this is going to unfold. Like if you want to kind of step up in, however which way that you kind of want to step it up. A lot of times the message of Saturn is the outcome depends on your input. Not always. Like
absolutely.
sometimes Saturn is also kind of a little bit of a buzzkill. Like when Saturn transits come around, like you just are bummed out, or things, it's just like harder to get that sense of lift. It's hard to feel as excited or up leveling with Saturn. It's a little bit more of a hard earned quality.
Yeah, because it speaks so much to longevity, right? Like the intention you're putting into something, or even just the action you put into something. Saturn is ensuring you are rewarded by your own action, right? It's not like there's going to be an external source that just provides this to you. You're doing the work, you're sowing the seeds, you're waiting to see the results that come up from this. So I always see Saturn as this planet of compounding interest, where it's like, the more affirmative action you put in, it will reward you, but it will take time. It needs to keep adding on and on and on, so that eventually you have a structure that works for you within your life.
Totally. Yeah. Anytime I've had a Saturn transit, it always feels like I'm putting in a lot of like thankless effort, but later on, I'm going to be so happy that I did that.
Yeah. Yeah. It can feel like that. Like, I just feel like at least for the past 4 years of my life, it's just been one big Saturn transit.
Oh,
So it's
yeah.
very much like, I agree. There's been so much where I'm doing so much and I'm like, what am I doing this for? Right? Like, what is the end goal? And I think that's something with Saturn as well. We don't always know what the end goal is going to be, but we know that every action we're adding to is going to create something that we know does end up helping us. So is something that's completely worth it within our lives.
Yeah. Well, I love to hear that you're sort of like in the thick of this Saturn transit. It's fresh. I'm just coming out of Saturn squaring my moon personally. So I'm grateful to have a break, but you bring up a really great point about, like what is the end goal here? In other words, I think Saturn really helps us to prioritize. And so sometimes Saturn is telling us to say no to something in order to say yes to something else. I think of Saturn, I think of distillation, I think about, trying to kind of like crystallize someone's essence. And so you're often having to do, you're often having to say no to things that you maybe enjoyed, but they aren't going to lead you to where you want to be.
For sure, because I think Saturn's a planet that helps so much with identity and how we form identity. So when something isn't working out anymore, we recognize that that's a part of our previous identity we're letting go of, we have to say goodbye to. And it's the same in how we identify ourselves with relationships, with work, with even passions and interests that we have. There's almost like a new person that we're having to grow into and move into, and Saturn really helps define that transition.
Absolutely. So yeah, that kind of brings us to the significance of the Saturn return. So as you mentioned, we go through our Saturn return around the age of 30. Like it's kind of oftentimes, if you're looking at it from a sign-based perspective, you're going to look at, let's say, if your Saturn is in Pisces, like it is right now, then you might look at that 2.5 to 3 year transit as being your Saturn return.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I was letting you continue.
Yeah. And you can have other Saturn transits to other points, but this is one that every person will experience. So in your late 20s, early 30s, you're going to be going through your Saturn return. And it's basically a really big grow up transit.
For sure, for sure. I think every person who's experienced kind of early adulthood, at least within their 20s, knows that it's almost like you're from age 20 to 30, you're re-experiencing life again. I sometimes think you're this big kid that just has all the responsibility on their own. You have to be accountable for everything you do, but you get these phases of experimentation, and there's certain transits that line up with this as well, that happen in your early 20s. But I feel like 30 is kind of that point where when we experience the Saturn return, it kind of says, okay, like let's build a foundation for what you want the rest of your life to be. Like what do we need to do? What do we need to get rid of, say goodbye to? What do we need to add into our lives that's going to be I always say appropriate for the type of growth your natal chart shows. And that's where, the Saturn return is more individual to you and more applicable to your life too.
Yeah, I love that. I love what you just said. And so you do a lot of Saturn return work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Saturn's always been I think if it was the planet that I was most interested in when I first got into my own personal astrology, because I'm completely Saturn ruled. A lot of my planets fall into Saturn signs of Capricorn and Aquarius. And my own Saturn is just the bane of my life in my chart. So it was a good planet to kind of start to work with and start to remediate. And it was something that I was interested in with other people. So helping them with understanding their Saturns and moving through kind of Saturn transitions or periods with them, even doing Saturn return specific work as well. Because I think Saturn's both this extremely personal planet, but also non-personal.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at the conditions of someone's Saturn within their chart, it's so important to see what the condition of that Saturn is, how they can work with it, what that Saturn's hoping to bring up for them as themes around their Saturn return, and ensure that at the same time it's working with the kind of cultural significance, the sociology of transiting Saturn and everything that's going on a collective level as well.
Beautiful. It sounds like you're really great at helping people become friends with their Saturn.
Yeah, you have to, this is a planet that is already a bummer. So it's like, instead of berating your Saturn or, demeaning it or demeaning yourself through your Saturn, it's better to just become friends with it and accept, there's certain shadows you need to face in your life and understand that they're here to help you. Once you form that relationship with Saturn, I think its transits do become a lot easier for sure.
Totally. Yeah. And it's very common. Like you'll hear a lot of people rag on Saturn. Like people will be like, I hate Saturn. Why is Saturn prohibiting me and blocking me and creating all these hurdles? But once you are practicing astrology or observing astrology for some time, you start to notice how Saturn is actually looking out for you.
Yeah, so much. And it's funny because I think a lot of times there's this comparisons, right, between, let's say, Saturn and Jupiter. We look at Jupiter and we think, okay, the greater benefic, this is a planet we love, it expands, it brings luck, it brings all these things towards us. And so we have this affinity towards it. Whereas we look at Saturn as like, it's complete opposite. And we think, there's so much language around Saturn, like you said, especially online or just in person, where it's like Saturn is this devil planet, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to have association with it. It's going to just completely cut me off from everything. It's isolating me. It's doing all these bad things or bringing up these bad qualities happening in my life. So Saturn is this planet of blame. It's this planet that we look to and we say, it's your fault. You're doing this to me. I don't think you're helping me. Yet when something goes right in our lives, suddenly it's Jupiter's trait. It's, I know this is because Jupiter's doing this thing for me. It's looking out for me. It's helping me. Yet most of the time, Jupiter's probably putting you into situations where you're having to really like figure it out for yourself that not everything's going to go your way, that, you're not entitled to everything that you think you are, that movement isn't as easy, especially in adulthood, as it may have been maybe, when you were a child. Yet Saturn is helping you understand boundaries, is helping you understand these responsibilities and attributes that you need to learn that are going to just be so helpful in your later experience, present and later experience.
Yes, so much so. And isn't that like the bane of Saturn, of someone else getting the credit? But if you're working with Saturn, you're going to see, oh yeah, Saturn's got my back. And you bring up so many great points about what Saturn can offer us. And that makes me think about, becoming a parent. And so obviously people become parents during a lot of different planetary transitions. And the experience itself is very Saturnian, I would say. But I could totally understand how becoming a parent during the Saturn return would make it feel a little bit more like intense, because you do have to sacrifice a lot when you make that transition, and your time becomes even more of a valuable asset when you become a
Yeah.
parent. And you have to be a little bit more careful because, you know, the apple never falls too far from the tree. And so, like, as I'm learning right now with 3-year-old, you know, I have to be careful about what I say.
Mm,
So there's that accountability thread that is so strong in this Saturnian experience of parenthood.
for sure, for sure. I think it's also so something in my practice that within the past 2.5 years I started to incorporate a lot more was epigenetics, right? And it's just the overview of epigenetics is essentially we have specific kind of attributes and structures that are passed down from our parents into literally our blood, and then certain environmental triggers can activate those. And that can be things like, you know, alcoholism, it can be substance abuse and stuff like that. But it can be even to the most minute things, such as like certain habits that you pick up, or just the way you interact and way you communicate, and stuff like qualities like that. So it's, when you look at the Saturnian experience of parenthood, it's like you said, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and you have to be so careful with how you're treating that child, how that child is growing up, because you are their main influence, you are their main support, you're their main structure for everything. And Saturn is a planet that represents structure. So your own, you know, becoming a parent within your own Saturn return is such an interesting dynamic, because the structural point of your life is changing so much, just on, you know, its own individual journey. And now it's having to cater to this other being, and everything has to be kind of revolving around that as well, because of how much demand there is from a child.
Totally. So I love that you bring up epigenetics. That's something I would love to continue to explore in this space. But yeah, I think Saturn definitely has a lot to say about that, because very often when you're going through your Saturn return, whether you're becoming a parent or not, there is like this definite familial thread that
Yeah.
tends to come up. So do you find that that comes up a lot in your work with Saturn return?
Absolutely. And it's not even dependent on where Saturn is either. Like, you know, sometimes we look at more familial houses, such as, let's say, the fourth house, or potentially even the third. It doesn't matter where Saturn is situated within the chart. I think all Saturn return work has to incorporate, in some instance, familial work, because you've got to think of it as this point of awakening where post Saturn return, or within your Saturn return, there's almost a liberation that starts to happen if you can lean into the Saturn return themes. And that liberation oftentimes can be liberating yourself from the limitations that were placed upon you because of the circumstances that you were born into, or because of the beliefs that were placed upon you by your parents or by family. And, you know, again, these are our first teachers. So they give the first essence of form that we have in terms of interaction and just our approach and perspective to lives. So with our Saturn return coming around, it's usually a point where we're breaking away from that. We're changing the barriers of existence that we have for ourselves.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I can remember going through my Saturn return, and, you know, there's different stages of sort of disconnecting your parents from the archetype of what a parent is to you in your child brain, to, oh, you're just like a human being, just like everybody else, and you're flawed. And, you know, you maybe weren't perfect and it affected me in these ways, but, you know, you start doing the work of disentangling that. And yeah, I just remember that being like a very significant point of transition during the Saturn return, of just like, oh, like, I see that you're a human.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, it's interesting, during the Saturn return, there's either a lot of rage that comes up, or there's a lot of just forgiveness. You know, sometimes there's, you know, I've worked with so many clients now, and I either find they're at this point where they're like, Isaiah, I'm tired of like what's happened with, you know, maybe it's a specific parent or it's just parents in general. There's this, just this anger that comes out, and it makes them more reactive around their Saturn return. And I think it's significant. It needs to come up, because Saturn is saying, like, release this emotion, see it, highlight it, understand how it's taking effect within you. Because Saturn is also a planet that, if you think of how Saturn works, it works with the sun and the moon very closely, because its nature is to oppose them. And if you think of the moon being one that is so subconscious, Saturn also works with our subconscious to help see where any kind of quality or emotion that exists and is festering within our subconscious can act itself out in our lives, and almost define what our lives will look like too. So that needs to come up, it needs to be released and highlighted, and there needs to be an awareness of it to then change it, to then embrace things like forgiveness.
Oh,
And there's the opposite end where some clients are just already at that stage where they think, I've spent my life being angry, I've spent my life being reactive. Now I'm ready to understand that, again, they're human, just like I am. They were in a situation where I am now, where they didn't know the answers to everything. How could I ever expect them to? And yes, it's a point of forgiveness. It's a point of acceptance and almost transcendence, where you're like, I get it now. And I may not always be on good terms with them, or I may not always be forgiving of everything that had happened to me, but I'm forgiving of the fact that they're their own people and they did the best that they could with what they had.
I love that. I love that you bring up the spectrum of what people might be experiencing in their process. And, whether you fall a little bit to one side or the other, or you're oscillating in between, it's all good. But I love the point you bring up too, about how Saturn is the opposite of the luminary, and how a lot of times Saturn gets like, a lot of times we're looking critically at Saturn's nature for being opposite of the sun and the moon. But what you bring up is so beautiful about how Saturn is like a reflector. And I love that. I love that so much. So Isaiah, let's talk about this thread that you did. Let's get into it. Can you tell us a little bit about this Saturn return thread that you did?
Yeah, I think it was funny. It was inspired after a lot of my threads are actually inspired after working with clients. So I was working with a client on their Saturn return reading, and we'd also done kind of some synastry with they had issues with their mother. So we were looking at kind of synastry there, and just, what could be incorporated more to help them. And there was this conversation that I'd had with them where I was saying, it's more often than not, when we see the dynamic of you being the baby of your parents' Saturn return, there's this very interesting dynamic that comes up that I find isn't usually there with other kind of planetary transits that happen within our lives, and significant ones, where it's almost as if this baby can incorporate all the fears, anxiousness, insecurities that this parent has. Sometimes especially the mother, but it can be both the father and the mother as well. And it all plays out into this child. And, it's this moment where, like we said, there's transition, but with transition comes so much insecurity, so much anxiousness, so much lack of clarity, I think, that gets imbued into this child. And so I'd written that thread just to kind of describe how, when you recognize you're a Saturn return baby, you understand that the dynamic between you and your parents can be so innately different, because you carry these qualities of a harsher nature that can mean that the dynamic between you and your parent may be a little bit stifled in certain areas. It might be negligent in certain areas, and it might even be overbearing in specific areas as well. And honing in on those qualities and specific signatures of the relationship can help you maybe build a better relationship with your parent as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great point. Yeah, about how even if the parent consciously chose to bring the child into the world, that there can be like this subconscious, to use the word blame that we used earlier to associate with Saturn, of like, you're the reason my life got harder. You're the reason that I don't have time to socialize anymore. You're the reason I have to like work a lot harder. And like, so I mean, that makes sense that if you're kind of going through both those transitions at the same time, that it's more difficult for the person to sort of disentangle those associations. And then the child sort of becomes associated with that transition.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is the thing as well, when I've explored this in terms of different socioeconomic conditions that we may come from as well. Like I've let's say from my own personal experience, my parents didn't have a lot of money. Even when I was born, there were so many things that were happening that meant that we just weren't in the best of place. And when I think of how there were still these signatures that just weren't so helpful in my development and everything that I had to go through as a child, it's still also reflected in, let's say, someone whose parents had a lot of advantage to them and were well resourced and were able to, still cater to the child in terms of all their physical needs, yet there's an emotional ability that may have been lacking, or quality that just may not have been there in the way that they needed it. So in a way, this Saturn return condition, it transcends some of those socioeconomic qualities as well, which has been really interesting for me to know in my practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're, so just to kind of like clarify what you just said. So you actually are one of your parents' Saturn returns?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, both of them actually. So though it was the end of my father's, because they're only a year and a half apart, I'm more like my mother's Saturn return is almost directly upon, my mother's Saturn is almost directly upon my own Saturn.
By degree?
Yeah. This is a 2-degree difference. So
wow. Yeah.
like
So then
in the thick of it.
yeah. So both of them were going through their Saturn return, but
Yeah.
yours is closest by degree to mom's.
Yeah.
Wow. So yeah. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you experience that?
For sure. So there's always been a difficulty with my mother, where interestingly in my life, I was the only child out of 4 that was planned. So there was this conscious notion of bringing me into this world. And I always see that with like my Saturn being in Aries specifically, with Aries being this thing, this, intention, this spark, this point of creation. Mm-hmm. And, although the conditions for them were something that they had planned about and that they were ready for, the dynamic between me and my mother specifically has always been so strained, because it's almost like I represent everything she had wanted from a child. I had these qualities of intelligence and intellect and emotional openness that maybe like my father didn't have and that my brothers didn't have. And there was, there was an appreciation for the things that my mother also loved, like reading and certain musical interests. We shared so much, especially early on in life. I was always listening to, her old VHS films and watching them, and the music as well, and playing her old cassettes. So we had so many great interests that were shared, yet there was always this strain of me wanting more from life and her falling into this state of acceptance. And I think that's where the dynamic was, so ultimately strained. It was also the fact that her belief systems were different to mine, especially as we grew up, and especially around things such as identity, which is what Saturn gives form to when we talk of how it works with, let's say, the luminaries, right? Mm-hmm. Specifically the sun. The sun is providing the spirit to all what our identity could be and what we could define ourselves as. Saturn could be the point where it teaches us the capacity of that identity. And I think when my mother had become so complacent with the conditions of her life and her marriage, and even as a mother, how she was, I was non-complacent with it. I wanted to be different and want more and extend myself outside of the familiar conditions that I was in, on an economic level, financial level, but also on a mental level too. I didn't agree with certain cultural beliefs that we had. And that was always the issue. It was always this, how can you encapsulate so much of what I wanted and so much of the dreams that I know I could have had, but can't because of the conditions she fell into, yet do so in a way that doesn't capture my ideal. And it's interesting, my mother's Saturn is actually retrograde, whereas mine is direct. So I think that's where a lot of the tension also grows in the motion that her Saturn is that the point where she had me, she just kind of fell into this state of, okay, this is how the rest of my life is going to be, and this is how I'm going to tend to it. Whereas I represent almost everything she could have been.
Yeah. And it's interesting how your experience of sharing that Saturn signature has that Aries quality of individuality.
Yeah.
I'll never forget this episode of Blackish I was watching. It's a show. I don't know if they play it in the UK,
I know Blackish, but I haven't watched it, unfortunately.
But there was like this scene where, the main character, Andre is his real name. And he's like, thinks he's going to kick his son's ass in basketball. And his son just like owns him. And I thought that was such like a Saturn moment of, like you see your kids start shining and you're busting your ass and you're like, I'm not shining. But I do have to say, I see millennial parents, taking more steps to make sure that they still have a piece for themselves, because I think millennial parents do understand that, like, I can be a better parent if I take care of myself. But I think earlier generations didn't quite realize that fully.
No, for sure. And obviously, when you look at the societal conditions back then as well, it didn't grant them that access. I think at least with millennials now, there's more of this. I understand I can actually own my individuality and do more for myself. Whereas when that option isn't available to you, to suddenly have it there, later on in life, it can be, there's a tension with it because you think maybe I'm not deserving of it, or you think it's too late for me to access that reward, or just individuality. So it's definitely hard for them. But I think what you were saying about this potential, right? I think potentiality is something that comes so much with the Saturn return child, where if you think of Saturn's journey on a mythological level, one thing that Saturn did was, he castrated his own father and then ended up swallowing whole his own children. And if you think of his own children being his creative potential, instead of allowing them to fester, instead of allowing them to happen, it almost happened in such a regressed way, in a gestational way, where everything had to be hidden. Zeus had to grow his power in a hidden way before he could free his siblings and so on. And it just, to me, I see that represented so much in my life, where I had to hide so many elements of myself and let them grow in privacy before I could then take on my own autonomy, tap into that kind of Saturn and Aries quality that I have, and then shine, and put myself forward and really represent everything that I wanted to in an authentic way that wasn't hidden and wasn't private and didn't have to be something that was taboo.
Yeah. I love that you bring up the Saturn myth of swallowing the children, and like, it's control. It's so that like that essence of that scene I just described kind of doesn't happen. Because Saturn in the myth didn't want his own children to overthrow him the way that he overthrew his father. So there's like this control element. And so I guess I should share too that I'm my father's Saturn return. And by far, I have had like the most challenging relationship with my father. And I would attribute that to some other things, including that we both share a Scorpio moon within a few degrees of one another. But being his Saturn return and really kind of meditating on that has made a lot of sense for me in understanding. Because, for example, I'm the firstborn. And so my father used to get so mad when I would like come home from school with a mohawk. I was in like hair school.
Yeah.
And I'd walk into his house with this giant, like, FU looking mohawk. And my dad would be like, ugh, why can't you just be normal?
Yeah.
And I had to pay for my own guitar lessons. But then by the time we get to my siblings, he's taking them to music school, so we just had this different experience. And I think it really took, probably until my Saturn return. So it was his Saturn return too, where I think he came to a place of acceptance. Like, oh, I didn't have to control every facet of my daughter's life. She actually turned out okay. And it was around the Saturn return that he became really good friends with my now husband, and who's just as goofy as I am. So I think it was like the Saturn return experience itself that helped my father come into this place of acceptance about who I am, and that like, oh, she's I gave her enough skills that I don't have to like micromanage her, and it's going to be okay.
I really love that. This is where I think with Saturn return children, there's so much potential for there to be an openness that happens within that relationship that says, okay, we went through the challenges. We now see each other as individuals. We can respect each other, and we can, alleviate some of the previous tensions. And it's something that I find still hasn't happened yet with like my own personal experience, which, is a little bit of a shame, but is great to see with our clients, where I've seen with them, there's been a growing in the relationship with their parents. And, there's again, just this transition that happens where now suddenly doors have been opened that weren't there previously.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God, my dad just called me. I had my phone on.
Talk of the devil.
It's true. Yeah, I had my phone on do not disturb, but if you call multiple times, the call goes through.
It goes through.
My dad. His ears were burning.
Definitely.
Oh, that's so funny. Well, I hope that, because you're coming up on your Saturn return. So I hope that,
Yeah, soon.
that cycle is healing for you and your folks in the ways that you haven't seen yet. I will say that because, when you share a planetary signature with a parent, it's going to be sensitive when activated by transit. So anytime you have like a shared degree or shared planet, with your parent, you're going to kind of be going through some of the similar activations at the same time. So I did also want to share, as I was kind of like meditating on our conversation today, I was thinking about the Saturn opposition. And my father and I went through that together, obviously. And that was by far the toughest. So that was the toughest time in our relationship when I was about 15. That's when you're going to go through your Saturn opposition. And that's when he was having the toughest time with me. And we were just butting heads. And I think he just wanted me to emulate himself. He wanted me to emulate his ideals. He wanted to be able to brag about me in the way that he wanted to brag about me, not necessarily for who I was. But I think that was a huge source of our conflict. But yeah, that opposition point was definitely the hardest. Did you experience any of that as well?
For sure. Around 15 was also when both with my mother and father, it was really difficult because I think around the ages of 15, 16, that's when it was like, I'm stepping into my own. I see more of what, the adulthood could be like for me. I have more options available. It's interesting. Around that time, I was actually applying because in the UK, we have, so I think where you guys have high school, we kind of end and then we go to a college. And then from college, we do a specific set of qualifications and then we can go to university. So around that time, I'd entered college and I was doing more than was required of the qualifications that we have available, which are A-levels, because my plan was to actually study in Stanford, and I'd got accepted for the scholarship around that time too, after putting in all this hard work. Yet, because it was against the wishes of my parents, they actually stopped me from going. So there was this massive just war and conflict between myself and my parents. And, it was mainly my mother who didn't want me to go because she was losing this part of herself and she was losing this sense of control that she had when I was around. That was also the point as well where my sexuality first came out and was known to them as well. So there was even a point where I'd actually had to leave the home by force because of just the tension that arose religiously and with their beliefs and how they felt about it, also even for my own safety. So in a way, I was propelled into individuality and propelled into adulthood a lot earlier as well because of kind of the circumstances that came up around the opposition. And weirdly, around the Saturn square that happened later on, where for me, when Saturn was in Capricorn, so just, quite recently, that was actually where the last point of contact with my parents and with my mother specifically happened. So it was almost like this point of catharsis that happened from the opposition to the square, where it just caused this point of, I have to go no contact. I can't interact with you any further because I'm on a journey that I know is trying to heal all of this. And you're still setting your beliefs in ways that I know don't work with the type of growth that I'm going on to. So there's, the specific signatures we go through with our Saturn that you experience together. I know in my head, emotionally for her, it was just as difficult, but I, as my own individual person, I have to honor my own happiness and my own growth over hers, And I think there's a weird exchange there.
And boundaries, that's another really important Saturn return is you have to protect your own autonomy. And sometimes you do have to set boundaries with a parent. And I'm glad that you were able to put yourself first and, you're killing it. I love you. And so many other people love who you are and your shine. And so it's, hopefully one day your folks can recognize that too.
For sure. I think people see it as, I think sometimes people can see, these signatures as they're so harsh and they're, whether you have experienced them or you're yet to experience them, they can be harsh and they can be extremely difficult, but they can be rewarding as well, dependent on the action that you have to make from them. I don't define myself by the experiences I've gone through with them or any trauma that was suffered with them and the challenges. I just see it as a point of my journey that was helping me get to this point of, acceptance of light. And now I try to encompass, a lot of love. So it's, again, it can be helpful for your journey. So helpful when you lean into it like that.
And isn't that a Saturnian thing where in the moment you're going through something and it feels unfair and it feels limiting and it feels harsh and just awful. But then, the Saturnian element of time, once you get further from the experience, you see, this has shaped me. This has taught me some things that, I wish things were different in the past, but maybe I wouldn't change who I am today.
For sure. It's like that phrase, we hate it when something is happening to us, but time does heal all. It really does. It gives space for grief to happen. It gives space for so many of these feelings that we need to go through that enable our healing and enable us to get to a point of, a point of satisfaction with ourselves where we're comfortable now and secure. I think security is something that time can provide too.
Time. Yeah. It's amazing how if you just give something some time, it works out in a way that can just blow your mind sometimes. But what you were talking about too, about the opposition, as we're talking about this opposition, it brings up something for me about how, the opposition is connected to Saturn. The opposition itself is Saturnian. And with Saturn being the outsider, made to feel like an outsider, and your differentiation becomes a lot more pronounced around the age of 15 when you're going through that opposition. And that's true for anyone, whether your parents' Saturn return or not. And I remember, in my studies, learning about the Saturn cycle, that around the age of 15 is when you start to kind of like connect with other adults, and other adults start to show you, other ways of being an adult. And as a teen, you start kind of like noticing, that's like around the time where you first start noticing like, maybe my parents don't have all the answers. And you start like, having other adults that you grow close with and can learn from around that age.
Yeah, your influences change significantly, I think, because you start to relate on other qualities. If you think around that time, most of us are in school as well. So where, we have actual teachers that aren't just helping us with the subjects that we're learning, but also how they present and what they represent in terms of their own values and own belief systems and opinions. And we start to connect with those that we think actually, they work with who I think I'm becoming, or who at 15, 16, who you think you are. So it's really significant, that point of any person's life where you are stepping into your own because of the new interactions that you're having in the new, like you said, there's more ways to be an adult than just how your parents have shown you how to be one.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because I had even though our experiences were different, I also had my parents, my dad try to sabotage. I wanted to go to hair school at 15. And he was like, no, you're going to college or university. You're going to do that. And I was like, well, I could still do that, but I want to go to hair school. And my mom was the one who like signed me up for hair school, but I also had to leave his home. So I also was like kind of kicked out of my dad's house for a while. And, I do have to say that even though things were so difficult for so many years, I mean, the time thing has been just really helpful in our situation. And I feel like with my relationship with my dad, it's one of those very Saturnian experiences where we have to continue to show up. We have to continue to put in the work. Like our relationship today is good, but it hasn't come easy. We continuously have to work toward it together. But that's Saturn for you, like sometimes Saturn, unfortunately, will say, this is a no, this is difficult, or, sometimes it'll say this is possible, but you really have to work on it. And that's been the case for us. So yeah, I'm grateful, but it's been Saturn, it's been work.
Yeah, I love what you said as well. You know, it reminds me of just how necessary specific pain is for a human. Whether that's like, if we look at it on a physical level, you know, there's certain points of stress our body actually needs to undergo, whether it's through exercise or just like movement and mobility to ensure endurance, you know, and on an emotional level as well, when we experience any form of stress, you know, something that just showcases that we can evolve to endure more and go through more. I really think the kind of Saturnian quality of that dynamic showcases how it's necessary for certain growth that you're going to go on, that enables you to work with that parent a lot more or have a better relationship in the long run. You know, where the opposition had caused quite literally an opposition, you know, some form of conflict or separation. I think working on that post Saturn return or within the Saturn return is always this dynamic of the parent kind of working for forgiveness and the child working to showcase that, you know, there's always more to be done and there's more to give in this relationship.
Yeah, so that's some really great advice there and ways to kind of like think about the Saturn return and how we could you know, move through that process of repair if possible when we reach that threshold with our Saturn return parent. So we've talked a lot about how when you are born on your parent Saturn return, that it can often coincide with some difficulties. But I love, you know, some of the positive spins that you've shared here too, Isaiah, about how we can move through that period with grace. So what kind of, if, you know, we're coming to an end here, what kind of advice might we give to someone who is, you know, maybe on both sides of it? Like if you are an expectant parent and it's your Saturn return, what kind of advice might we give that person?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one, right? I think this is where I always say, let it be a chance that you never had. Right. So if you're an expecting parent now within your Saturn return and you're also, you know, a Saturn return baby yourself, just think of everything you were stripped of, everything that you weren't provided, you weren't given. Be the person who can bridge that gap of not, you know, of absence to fulfillment, you know, and provide all that potential that you know you were owed into your child, and let it be a journey you go through together. You know, let it be something that is a union instead of a separation. And I think that's where Saturn can really work to favor you, and you can take on these Saturnian qualities that actually are wonderful. You know, again, coming back to, let's say, the myth of Saturn. Saturn is chthonic, so it was an earth god. It sows seeds. You know, it talks of agriculture and what we can grow and what we can build together when there's a significant structure in place that enables that. And you can be that person for your child.
I love that. I love that. And it's hard.
It is hard. Yeah.
It is hard. I had that moment with my daughter recently because she's a three-nager now and she's starting to push my buttons. And, you know, I had a moment where I was this close to snapping, and I took her and I carried her up to my bed. And then, you know what I did? I hugged her. And it took me, I knew in that moment, like, I'm shifting something. My parents would have done something. They would have let my ass have it, but I'm shifting something. And it was, you know, hard, but so rewarding. And yeah, so your advice is right on. Love it.
Yeah. And you're right, it is going to be difficult. Like this, you know, I think people embracing the positive side of things doesn't mean, you know, neglecting what's going to be difficult. There's going to be frustration. There's going to be so much irritation, you know, with especially a child, because you just, it's that a sense of control, right? You want them to kind of do things in the way that you're planning to, because you know it's best for them, especially when they're, let's say, a three-nager, right? You know what's best for them. They're not doing the right thing. But I think it's like you said, just changing the reaction to response. I think one thing that we as Saturn return babies understand is that we were so prone to the reactions of our Saturn return parents, and it's up to us to create a response from that, and a proper response, one that is compassionate, one that's loving, one that makes sure we're not repeating these behaviors. Because if there's one thing we have to come back to with Saturn, is of course it's the planet of the construct of time. And time showcases all the patterns that we go through. It showcases how we repeat mistakes and we repeat history. And I think if something is new, there's a potential for something else. We want to make sure we're not repeating that history with our children.
I love that. Isaiah, thank you so much for sharing all of your Saturnian wisdom with us. It's been so great to chat with you. Can you tell
Thank you.
us, where can people connect with you and how can people work with you?
For sure, yeah. So all my social media is available. So for Instagram, it's just Isaiah Alpheratz, but you can also search the Elysian Aquarius and it will come up. On every other platform, it's the Elysian Aquarius, and I'm sure, Catherine, you can just tag the socials.
I
There's
will.
also my website, which is theelysianaquarius.com, and on the website you can also see that I offer consultations. There's also bespoke packages of coaching. I do and will have kind of like a course or masterclass series coming up later on in the year that people can connect to as well. But there's always new masterclasses coming up or workshops that people can connect to, as well as one-to-one consultations.
Beautiful. Isaiah, thank you so much. It's been a joy having you on today.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for tuning in with us today on the Family Astrologer. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and we'll catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in with me today. Timing with Transits, my 11-week mentorship and predictive technique begins on September 21st. We're covering transits, we're covering perfections. We've got a blend of live and pre-recorded tutorials and ongoing support throughout the program. So if you want more information on that or you want to snag that early bird rate, head to my website, catherineurban.com.